Miscalculation. It is the word floating around the geopolitics water cooler at the moment. Someone in Israel, someone in the United States, or both, estimated that the coalition could force a regime change inside of Iran. That is how we ended up with another Gulf War, and it also explains why it has not succeeded thus far. Indeed, there is a New York Times article with insider accounts seemingly corroborating that argument. It is drawing comparisons to how the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, and it would help explain why there may be, or may not be, some peace talks happening behind the scenes, or soon in Pakistan. Well, we will indeed spend ample time today explaining why that is a plausible interpretation of the events that we have observed so far. Rejoice, for there will be lines and everything. However, a key piece of evidence offered to confirm the theory is actually evidence of nothing at all, and the logical failure stems, as usual, from a fundamental misunderstanding of why wars occur. Say it with me, everyone. Bargaining failure! Bargaining failure is the answer, and it is most definitely not because the threat of protest is high or low. So, today, let's examine the intelligence failure that may have led to the war, and why the lack of regime change so far is only a weak indicator of a potential underlying mistake. Let's start with the presumed miscalculation. Most of the factual reporting here comes from that aforementioned New York Times article, but I'm going to interject with my own social scientist caveats. The main revelation is that David Barnea, the head of Israel's intelligence service Mossad, believed that the Iranian public could be galvanized into rising up against its government within days of a war starting. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu got on board and set out to convince Donald Trump. U.S. intelligence was not as confident, nor was the U.S. military. For reasons unclear in the report, but something that we may be able to elucidate in a minute, Trump bought into the plan. The war has not yet produced those results. This applies to both standard protests in the streets, plus efforts to weaken Iran's security forces in the northwest of the country to allow for a more organized resistance coming from Kurdish militant groups. Frustration is now setting in among the coalition. Netanyahu with Mossad for conveying an inaccurate assessment, Trump with Netanyahu for being a driving force behind the war, and perhaps both parties with would-be protesters for not taking risks on the ground. Ironic given that Israel and the United States are not taking risks on the ground. A common theme from the main report and others is that U.S. intelligence consistently produced pessimistic assessments of the situation. Yet the United States went to war anyway. Keep that in mind as we go. Okay, that covers the substantive reporting on the matter. We need to transition now to some theory to better interpret the situation. As a baseline, longtime viewers will immediately recognize this as a private information bargaining problem. I will now cover the basics of the idea. If you are new to crisis bargaining theory, remember that I published a long introduction to the subject over on my secondary channel. Maybe watch that if you have some free time. Let's conceptualize the territory of Iran as representing 100% of the political disagreement between the Islamic Republic and the United States. It will help to visualize the central problem, even though this is not a true territorial war like Ukraine. Divisions toward the eastern end mean that the United States obtains something closer to its preferred policy, while divisions toward the western end mean that Iran obtains something closer to its preferred policy. In principle, there is an expected outcome of the war that aggregates everything that could happen over fighting, and averages out all of the random events that might happen during that period. Notably, this expected outcome incorporates the likelihood of protesters rising up against the Iranian government. The more likely this is to happen, the further right we would push the expected outcome. That is because it would be hard for the current government to implement its preferred policies if it is no longer on the face of the earth. Equivalently, if the government can lock down protesters without issue, the expected outcome would drift further left. However, war is expensive both in terms of lives lost and the economic resources wasted on it. If you take those physical losses and weigh them by how much Iran values the policies in dispute, the space between the expected outcome line and this green line represent Iran's costs of war. You will notice that everything to the right of the green line is what Iran expects to obtain by fighting a war, net its costs. We can do the same thing on the other end for the United States. Its costs of war go the other way, between the expected outcome line and the blue line. Now everything to the left of the blue line is what the United States expects to obtain net its costs. Aggregating what we have deduced so far, you will notice that any division between the blue and green lines improves both parties' outcomes as compared to war. That is because they are all close to what war would produce in expectation, but neither side pays any costs. We call it a bargaining range because the parties can negotiate within it. This logic immediately throws aside one of the narratives that you will hear about the possibility of protests causing the war. By the account of the New York Times article, the White House started the war because, brushing off U.S. intelligence assessments, it believed that protesters would likely come to the aid of the U.S. cause. Thus, the United States calculated that a war would be profitable. And as Rule of Acquisition 6.7 says, do not leave any profit on the table. Let me be clear and blunt about that argument. It holds no logical coherence and is devoid of strategic reasoning. It makes the rounds because it has an aura of sensibility. But once you try to think through the mechanism that takes you from the premise to the conclusion, it all falls apart. You can be pessimistic about an outcome and still start a war. Remember, the expected outcome line incorporates the likelihood of protesters assisting the United States. Thus, the first-order consequence of a high probability of protesting is to move the line to the right. But that just means that the negotiated resolution should correspondingly be favorable to the United States. It does not mean that a war will occur. Likewise, a low probability of protesting just means that the negotiated resolution should be favorable to Iran. Whether someone rejects or not is therefore a function of the offer put on the table, not an isolated calculation of whether war will result in an objectively good or bad outcome. In other words, what the protests mean war argument fails to realize is that negotiating positions are a function of war expectations. Both parties' stances should reflect what the underlying balance of power is. Way too many arguments ignore this point at their own peril, and I have 2 post-it notes on my wall ready for me to write about other applications of this idea, if 2026 might calm down for just a second. Hey, at least we are taking care of one of those post-its today. That said, we can still link protesting incentives to why wars occur. We just need to add an extra premise to the argument. One explanation is that the likelihood of successful protest was shifting over time. This is a very reasonable possibility, but we have also explored it a bunch over the last few weeks, so I do not want to rehash that again today. Another explanation that is consistent with the White House leaks is that there was a discrepancy between US expectations and Iranian expectations. For example, it is reasonable to think that the Iranian government better understood the state of protesting in the country on the eve of war. They are the ones with security forces on the ground, updating them on what the average citizen is thinking. And while the United States gets some of that information too, they will be spotty and clouded by both distance and regional knowledge. In turn, you could end up in a situation where the Iranian government knows that it has cracked down on protests with harsh enough measures, that it has broken the will of all dissidents. Even with US support, they will not be eager to return to the streets. Meanwhile, it is possible that the intelligence chatter emanating from Iran is more optimistic. Yes, the crackdowns have pushed people back inside their houses, for now. But the underlying sentiment is still there, and will explode if a US intervention can take care of some of the dirty work. To visualize the problem, it is like the United States believes that the bargaining range is over here. The intelligence community concedes that this assessment might be wrong, but that is its best guess. In contrast, Iran knows the reality of the situation looks like this. Consequently, the United States will demand a bunch at the bargaining table, but Iran will hold firm. That is how you get war. Private information drives apart each party's expectation of what war will produce. Now, it is easy to rail against intelligence organizations for always being overly optimistic about war expectations. And certainly we have another prominent case of that logic running concurrently to the Iran war. But that is a misleading conclusion to draw, because it over-indexes on the more salient cases. When intelligence organizations get it right, we do not observe wars. After all, if the parties have a consensus on the bargaining range, they ought to simply hammer out a deal. And I know that this is hard to appreciate given the current mess of a world that we live in, but most countries are at peace with most other countries most of the time. Intelligence failures like the one I just described are the outliers. In addition, when intelligence organizations are unnecessarily pessimistic, we also do not observe wars. Here, the United States would come to the bargaining table asking for very little. Iran would be slightly confused as to why the United States is not acting more belligerent when Iran knows that the situation is actually precarious. But Iran will not look a gift horse in the mouth and instead take what is offered, which in this case would be a lot offered from the United States. The only way that we get war under these circumstances is when the intelligence organization is too optimistic, and there is no way to verify that over-optimism short of finding out on the battlefield. These are the cases that get shelves of history books written about them, but I, as a social scientist, am here to remind the world that those are not the average cases. Moving along. War as a consequence of uncertainty immediately reveals a critical implication. The baseline expectation of protester success need not be high for a war to occur here. I have been drawing the difference in expectations as massive because it helps visually illustrate the problem. In practice, what matters is the extent of the difference in state expectations as compared to the costliness of war. For example, in this case, the United States is fairly pessimistic that the war will result in a good outcome. However, Iran knows that the United States should be even more pessimistic. This results in a war because Iran will be incredibly obstinate in negotiations. The United States will not ask for much at the bargaining table, reflecting its own moderate pessimism, but Iran will still reject even those minimal demands. This is interesting because it is very difficult for us as outside observers to adjudicate whether a war is a success purely by looking at the war outcome itself, or even leaked intelligence reports. For example, it is easy to draw the conclusion that the Trump administration was ignoring the pessimistic reports from US intelligence, and instead acting hopelessly optimistic based on Israel's account. And maybe that was the case. But it is not valid to argue in support of that case that the war does not make sense otherwise. That is, if the administration had been listening to US intelligence, there is no way that a war could have occurred. Not when US intelligence is pessimistic. Well, again, pessimism does not explain whether a war happens here or not. The difference in expectations between the United States and Iran is what matters. Look, you will hear me say a ton on this channel that I don't know things, or we don't know things. This is not a cop-out. I would love to know things, but that is just not how international relations works. It is an opaque world out there, and certainly in a time when disinformation is everywhere, and getting worse based on the comments that I see on social media, my own channel's comments included, it is important to get our argumentation right. That is why I am here. Not to give you partisan perspectives on the world, even though I have my own thoughts on these matters. And yes, I do have opinions, and I do have personal biases, which color whether I think a politician is acting in good faith or not. However, I do not discuss those because what I am obsessed with is the logical validity of argumentation. That is it. That is my job. I just want us to have a better conversation about the political climate, because goodness, that is hard these days. Back to the subject matter at hand. To hammer home just how hard it is to assess who is making the intelligence mistake, we could imagine an alternative world where Iran was unduly optimistic about its chances, and the United States had the accurate intelligence assessment. Goodness knows it would not be the first time that a country misunderstood its own military capabilities. With the script flipped, this time it is Iran that comes to the bargaining table asking for too much. The United States refuses, and a war erupts. Here, though, the expected outcome of the war will be objectively poor in expectation, regardless of whether Iran's assessment was correct or the US assessment was correct. For us as keyboard warriors to judge whether the war was a good idea or not, we would have to compare it to what was on the bargaining table. The war outcome itself is not particularly telling because it has no frame of reference. I want to raise this point because many articles discussing the intelligence situation conflate the logic here. They will point to the lack of protesting on the ground as clear evidence of a mistake to pull the trigger. They will often suggest that US intelligence said that protests would happen, or Israeli intelligence said that protests would happen, rather than using the metrics of uncertainty that actual intelligence reports include. There is reason to believe that the Trump administration was pessimistic overall about the uprising chances, based on the messaging of its war objectives. Outside of Trump's initial speech declaring war, regime change is a subject that the administration tries to avoid. And even in the war declaration, it was a suggestion to the Iranian people rather than an explicitly laid out objective. The reason that you would hedge if you were pessimistic about the chances there is that it would look politically bad if regime change is a stated goal that fails to come to fruition. In contrast, if the administration were more optimistic, you could imagine regime change playing a more central public role to rally more support to the cause. And goodness, they would like more support right now, this being the least popular start to a war in American polling history. A historical perspective, which people both in the Pentagon and State Department are trained on, also gave reason to be skeptical overall entering the conflict. This strategy to produce regime change has no prior case to build on. Interventions normally assist existing rebellions. They do not normally try to foment a rebellion. We have been watching a very expensive experiment from day one. Regardless, what the media discussion does not place enough emphasis on is the comparison between US beliefs and Iranian beliefs, even though that is necessary for this mechanism to cause war. As a final point, we ought to discuss the implications for war termination. The standard analysis here also misses some of the subtleties of bargaining failure. Let's start with the optimistic outlook. If war occurs because of a discrepancy in the two countries' expectations, then it will end once those expectations have sufficiently converged. At that point, continuing to fight just imposes unnecessary costs on both sides. The bright spot here is that the United States can observe protest movements, or the absence thereof. It can then update its information accordingly. Note that for this to cause the war to end, it must actually be converging previously diverging expectations. If both parties have the same view of underlying protester dynamics, then any natural changes over time there simply shift around the bargaining range. They do not have an evident effect on eliminating bargaining frictions. Well, yesterday, it seemed that there was some headway in trying to sit down and negotiate a ceasefire. To be clear, I have no direct insight about what is happening there and whether anything in this information space is accurate. It is always fun when the two sides say opposite things, and it is even more fun when one side says things opposite of what it has already said. However, if you believe that the war started as a consequence of over-optimism from the United States, then it would make sense why the lack of protest movements on the ground is causing the White House to seek a diplomatic solution. The intelligence organizations are beginning to believe that the initial assessments were wrong, and so it is time to ratchet down demands accordingly. Still, the reporting on this front lacks some of the nuance that the private information theory tells us. If we live in a world where the United States believed that the daily risk of protests was unlikely, but Iran just thought that they were even less likely, then the absence of protests so far tells us little about which perspective was correct. To make that idea a little more concrete, imagine if you did not know whether there was a 0% chance that a meteor would destroy all life on Earth on any given day, or a 0.0000001% chance. Then waking up alive and well tomorrow would make you slightly more optimistic, but not much. Well, it is the same principle with Iran, just a bit less extreme. That is why I am looking closer at the news regarding updated US intel assessments on the likelihood of protest movements starting. The intelligence community is looking beyond the mere absence of protests thus far. It is also gathering information on the underlying potential. In other words, they will figure this out well before we observe the reality publicly. And if they grow further pessimistic, in line with what Iranian expectations perhaps were at the start, then yes, I believe that the war will end sooner than later. Again, sooner than later, not tomorrow. Given that its armed forces are already there, the United States will want to stick around a bit longer to continue sabotaging Iran's production capabilities. But that is it. So, what have we learned? There is some evidence that the United States was overly optimistic in its assessment of protesters heading into the war. The media conflates generic optimism as a cause of war rather than a divergence in expectations between the parties. This may be coloring how the media report on the intelligence assessments. But if the undue optimism story is correct, then the war may end shortly. Meanwhile, it seems that my work just continues. Day 25 in a row is in the books. As you wait on day 26, why not check out this video if you want the full introduction to crisis bargaining theory? And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.